Welcome back to the Culture, Worldview, and Origin series. This topic is on critical thinking skills in science. We're on Culture, Chapter 2, and we're on the last video, which is number 4. We're on number 11, characteristic or tendency number 11, categories of thought. The Western tendency is to divide things up like everything else, divide things into boxes, and one is secular and sacred. So they have two different sections. And so a lot of people struggle with the fact that they wish that they had a sacred job or a sacred vocation, or because they're in a secular vocation, they might be in the field of plumbing or electrical, carpentry, auto mechanics, and they say, my vocation is not as good as somebody that's pastoring a church or something, because they're doing more, they're doing higher work. And it's kind of like that is Western tendency, to separate the secular from the sacred. The Western tendency also believes that the separation of church and state, you can do the same thing now. But can you really separate church from state? In other words, can you separate what you believe from what you practice? Non-Western tendency. Sacred, secular. Sacred is first, secular is second, and there's the two colons between them in that there's no division. In that when they go to work, they're worshiping the Lord by the work that they do. They're honoring Him, or they're being a testimony about Him by doing an honest day's labor. So in other words, the non-Western tendency is there is no separation between sacred and secular. It's a combination in that we should be consistent in how we live, and what we believe should be applied to how we work. Whereas in the Western tendency is that there's a separation, or we believe that we can separate things, and therefore we can do a secular science without any sacred interference. But do we believe in miracles? And if we do, then how do we incorporate them into our science? And it's kind of like modern science would say, you can't. Because modern science is based on methodological naturalism, so you cannot introduce anything non-natural into the cause and effect sequence. So categories of thought, that's a significant difference between the two cultures, in that a lot of times in the Western culture, we don't take to work with us what we say we really believe. And we go to church on Sunday and we practice one thing. We pull God out of the box, or we go to that box on Sunday. But then on Monday, we are back doing our secular job that might even be questionable because of what we say we believe on Sunday. So in other words, it can generate an inconsistency between our actions, our beliefs and our actions. Whereas the non-Westerner says, no, those are intertwined. I can't separate what I believe from what I do, and I can be a farmer, I can be anything, but I am taking my belief system with me, and that affects how I farm. Number 12, the relation of reason to faith. Again, now because the Western tendency is to put things in separate boxes, we can separate things. The Western tendency is to put reason at the base of all thinking. Reason is logic. And then up in the sky, or without any real base to it, a leap is faith. And faith is equal to a belief system which has no reason behind it. So in other words, those are two different concepts, and the Western tendency is to believe that faith is separate from reason. So in other words, it's not logical to have a faith. or it's illogical to be religious because of this separation. Whereas in the non-Western tendency, their faith is reasonable. Why do you believe that? Well, I believe this because of this, this, and this, what happened in history. I know that this is true because this is what happened. So in other words, their faith is reasonable because it's based on a previous action. It's based on something that happened in their context, in their historical context. So a big difference, again, between the two Western, non-Western relationship of how does reason relate to faith. The last one, number 13, is expression of faith. And how does the Western tendency express their faith? Well, they express it, I express it, we express it, our churches express it through creeds and or doctrines. In other words, if you want to join a church, then you have to take a new members class. And you go through all this doctrines and then sign on the bottom line, you agree. And then if you agree with that, then you are now a member of this Western church because you agree with the creeds and of the doctrines, creeds and doctrines. The non-Western church or group, however you want to apply it, is a little different. They look at deeds or actions because they're a verb-centered group, community. It's action-orientated. It's not static. It's not adjectives. It's not nouns. It's action words. So if you want to be a part of my group or my church, then your life has to reflect the deeds and actions that are congruent with what we believe in, with what our church represents, our group represents. And so maybe your testimony, let us observe you for a while. Why don't you come in and you participate with us for a certain amount of time, and we'll observe you and whether or not we want you as one of our members. And so this is two different ways of looking at things, because the expression of the faith, the Western expression, is analytical, it's doctrinal, it's internal, it's bits, it's information. Whereas the non-Western tendency is visual, it's outside, it's concrete, it's through observing, it's through action. Two ways of expressing our faith. So now we come to the question. Okay, the course is on critical thinking. Critical thinking skills as applied to science. So let's get around to this. Question: how would these cultural differences influence their concept of critical thinking? Are you getting an idea? Well, let me fill in the blanks a little bit more. Educational experts have come up with the idea that it is not enough to just teach critical thinking skills. Okay? What do we need to do? But teachers need to develop character dispositions in the students that allow for the expression of critical thinking skills. Okay, what do you mean character dispositions? Well, I think that's what we're kind of going over within the cultural tendencies, is their dispositions of a culture. How does a culture, how would you describe the disposition of the Western culture? And how would you describe the disposition of a non-Western culture? So in other words, what would these character dispositions be? What we're talking about now is critical thinking. Critical thinking skills, which is this course, is critical thinking skills applied to science. There's been a lot of research going on because they've seen or registered that our critical thinking skills are below average national or internationally. And so how do we bring up the critical thinking skills? And so they've taught towards critical thinking skills. And now they're saying it's not working to teach the skills to a student that isn't trained to use the skills. So in other words, a disposition is an inclination, a tendency, an ability to apply the skills that are called. The ideal critical thinker is habitually inquisitive, well-informed, trustful of reason, open-minded, flexible, fair-minded in evaluation, honest in facing personal biases, prudent in making judgments, willing to reconsider, clear about issues, orderly in complex matters, diligent in seeking relevant information, reasonable in the selection of criteria, focused in inquiry, and persistent in seeking results which are as precise as the subject and circumstances of inquiry permit. That's kind of a mouthful, but this is the description of what a disposition of a critical thinker needs to be before the critical thinker can think critically, is that they have to be disposed to these thought qualities. Now, based on that paragraph written by an educator, there has been summarized dispositions summarizing what those qualities mean. So, character dispositions for critical thinking. 1, truth-seeking. Number 2, open-minded. Number 3, analytical. 4, systematic. 5, confident in reasoning. 6, inquisitive. 7, maturity of judgment. These are the dispositions that they're saying now that we need to teach students that the student have this disposition, be disposed towards truth-seeking, open-minded, analytical, systematic. I don't know if you go back through and you want to look at the charts again of what is Western cultural thinking and what is non-Western cultural thinking and where this list fits in. But this list basically reflects a Western cultural bias of critical thinking, which means a student coming into a school system that's required to critical think may be a critical thinker, yes, but not according to the Western cultural tradition of critical thinking. So in other words, critical thinking also has a bias, a cultural bias, which translates into if a student is not culturally transformed into a Western cultural tendency thinker, then they might have difficulty applying or not measuring up with the correct dispositions to apply the critical thinking. So what I would call the critical thinking skills are actually Western cultural critical thinking skills versus non-Western cultural critical thinking skills. And we're going to go over in a later chapter critical thinking skills within a non-Western context. Again, just wrapping up with the quote by Stephen Jay Gould, and I think we're seeing what influence and why I gravitated towards his quote, in that first, facts do not come to us as objective items seen in the same unambiguous way by all reasonable people. But theory, habit, prejudice, and culture all influence the facts we choose to observe and the way in which we perceive them, and the way in which we critically think about them. That's wrapping up chapter number 2 on culture and how culture influences all the way down to the way we think. It actually has an influence on the development of our thinking processes and the structural capacity or the development of how we think. Thank you again for joining me. There's chapter 3 is coming up next, and so this is the end of culture. number 4 of wrapping up of how culture influences cognitive processing. Again, we're Tim and Holly Nyquist. If you'd like to communicate with us, you can do so through the email there, the thn.academia@gmail.com, or through cultureworldvieworigins.net. Thanks again.